thank my step for the trust invested in me, and I'll do everything in order to justify this trust together with my colleagues. Thank you, Mr. Tunyan. Now we'll look at the Finance, Credit and Budget Standing Committee Chair nomination. The introduction will be made by the Secretary of Bright Armenia, Mr. Georg Gorgisyan. Good morning, distinguished chair, dear colleagues. The Bright Armenia faction nominates for the Finance, Credit and Budget Standing Committee Mane Tandilyan, daughter of Vanya. We already have presented her from this lectern, therefore I will reflect on her professional and financial sphere skills and accomplishments. Since 2003 she's been working in finance. Since 2009 she was in charge of Synopsis Armenia. She was the accountant-in-chief and deputy finance executive officer. She's worked in international financial organizations, holding important offices. Since 2017 she was elected National Assembly member and was deputy chair of the Finance, Credit and Budget Committee. She has worked seriously there, studying the international experience of similar committees, especially their oversight over budget expenditures. She is ready and willing and capable to apply this experience here, increasing the reputation of both the committee as well as the National Assembly in the Armenian. She took part in the reforms of the audit chamber, in the discussions thereof. She has a great contribution in the transition to program budgeting. She was the deputy chair of that committee right then. I think I'll conclude that by reiterating, like I did last time, Madam Tandilyan is endowed with great talent. She may hold any responsible office with great honor and succeed in any area entrusted to her. So I ask you all to use this opportunity to vote for her to work at this responsible office.
Thank you, Mr. Gorgisyan. You may now ask questions to the person who presented the candidate. Mr. Gorgisyan, you may now line up the questions. Two MPs registered. Christine Pogosyan, the first. Thank you. I just wanted to make a small correction. You missed one very important thing, that she was a minister. Well, naturally, I was speaking of the financial sector activity of Mrs. Tandilyan. Yes, of course. Thank you. No response to that. Ovanes Ovanesyan is the next. Yes, I was going to ask the same question. Thank you. Questions up. Mr. Gorgisyan, you may take your seat. So now I give the floor to the candidate of the Financial Monetary Standing Committee, Mrs. Mana Tandilyan, please. Distinguished Chair, dear deputies, once again let me congratulate the distinguished deputy chairs for being elected, Mrs. Lena Nazarian, Mr. Alan Simonyan, and especially Mr. Enfiajan. I wish you an impartial, effective, fruitful work. Thank you to our colleagues for reminding some parts of my biography. Yes, indeed, I was the minister for 6 months of Labor and Social Affairs. I'm grateful to Bright Armenia political party for nominating my candidacy in this important position, and to my colleague for presenting my biography. and my working experience. Of course, I will be very grateful, and I'll be attentively hearing through all the discussions, especially given the fact that the deputy chairs have already been nominated. Still, I would like to speak of the mission of this committee, the main function, and why it is observed so important. So, indeed, its role is quite important in a parliamentary republic, in the function of parliamentary oversight, which essentially, to the largest extent thereof, is reserved to the Committee on Finance and Monetary Issues. So it is with this perceptions that I came to be nominated, because indeed oversight is going to be one of the most important functions of the parliament. So it is through fruitful and efficient monitoring or oversight of ours we will be creating a counterweight to the executive. So if I get the confidence from you, then I will be turning the parliament into this exclusive body of oversight that will allow the parliament to implement its function fully. So we permanently speak here of laws that were never implemented and remained on the shelf. So it is through this committee that we will be overseeing the implementation of those laws, and the control over the implementation will turn those laws into more practical, into better implemented, and not something that is distant from the reality. And we have numerous such laws, by the way. So this committee has the mandate to oversee the budget performance, and this has essentially been considered as even more important because we turned into program budgeting, and now we have to simply check the efficiency of expenditure of public funds, and respectively the assessment of the efficiency, and the conclusions and the discussions about that will be the mandate of this committee respectively. So the importance, I have to underline the importance of that process, independently from the fact that the discussions are going to be taking place inside the committee. We will be communicating that information in an effective manner to the parliament and to the society. I really signify the role of the Tallying Commission, and in fact, when we speak of the main brinks where the cooperation might collide, this is where the main threads are going to be developed. We have to find the main format, make it more effective. I mean, in terms of the cooperation between the committee and the Tallying Commission. To me, it is so important. The independence of the settlement body is of great significance. It is so new, and it has to become very professional, very skilled. An entity, the information of which is trustworthy and gives no way to doubts, and is a confident source of information. The work of the committee is quite significant in terms of overseeing the work of the central bank. Apart from just going through interim reports, it is also very important to tackle issues of possibility there, and we have to be able to prevent a lot of issues and find solutions to the existing ones. I have to say that there will be no issue which will be worth the public attention and not be exposed to discussions or hearings organized, initiated by our committee. This is a very specific, technically difficult sector, but those participating in it have to have a certain level of financial literacy to be protected. We hear of numerous problems and complaints from the citizens, mostly emanating from the absence of financial literacy, the most primitive financial postulates. That's where we have to inform our citizens so that they're better protected. And of course, the toolkits available for us largely that we may use through our operation. Our cooperation with independent bodies will also be very close and very intensive. This is where we have to be doing everything possible in order to efficiently organize our work so that we do not lose time in terms of assessing the efficiency of implementation of legislation. I have to say that there are numerous different organizations, stakeholders in the sector, the discussions with whom will become a tradition, because we have to be able to hold discussions very often with stakeholders, hear their opinions all the time, so that we are able to make acceptable decisions, making them efficient and quality. As it has already been mentioned, I have worked as a deputy chair of this committee. I had the opportunity to participate in the development of a number of laws in the final phases thereof, not from the very beginning, I may truly confess. And I can say that a lot of serious efforts were invested in perfection of financial drafts. In this respect, the continuity shall be guaranteed. I have to say that I'm generally aware of what the work has to do. I have to say that the committee cooperates with different organizations, including GIZ. I'm full of hope that we will continue our work with GIZ because it is very efficient and very useful. You may know that the presence of the budgetary office here in the National Assembly has significantly increased the possibility for the parliamentarians to master the information and to digest it, because we may understand that financial issues are strictly technical and professional. However, the information and the notices provided have definitely helped the MPs a lot. We will improve it, make it even more available, so that the MPs use it largely. It is through the efforts of this committee that program budgeting has become a reality in Armenia. This is where I have to extend my gratitude to the parliamentarians of the previous convocation who diligently, cordially were devoted to this work that lasted years and ultimately yielded certain results. And those results are now turning the implementation of our finance into something more efficient. That was it, mostly. Without any further ado, you know that I have worked in the financial sector in different organizations of it, and I'm hoping that the efficiency of our committee and the quality of the work thereof will significantly be improved through my chairmanship. Thank you, and I'm ready to hear your questions. Thank you, distinguished Mrs.
Tandelian. Thank you. You may now address questions to Madam Tandelian. Please sign up for it. Fifteen MPs have signed up. We'll start with Armen Pambukyan, please. Thank you, Madam Tandelian. I would ask you to flag the most important three dimensions of the budget where it has to be less saving, where it should be more exuberant. Expenditure for me is an investment. After all, there are certain sectors where when the expenditure becomes a capital investment, such as education, the development of all sorts of information technologies, and you know that the budget also has restrictions between expenditure items and capital investment. I would like us to pay more attention to infrastructure and steer expenditures there so that we can assure a long-term development prospect. Today, of course, we have difficulties in doing that, and basically within the framework of budget restrictions is what we're doing it rather than through our goodwill, but there's a reason for that. You know, social issues in Armenia are many, and here again we have to introduce a social protection system and spare no means to get it established. Thank you. Georgi Vorkyan is the next. Thank you. I welcome you, Madam Tandelian. And there are many questions, but I'll try to focus on the three, if you don't mind. In your presentation, you mentioned that there are laws that are stillborn. They're detached from life, and we have to somehow revive them or maybe bring to another plane. I assume this immediately pertains to 2018 budget, which last year was called an inertia budget. So I assume that if these laws were to be called to life, this budget may assure a higher efficiency? That's my first question. I am interested in your opinion on this. In second question, you mentioned that there are issues in the financial system that are asking for urgent discussion and solutions. Could you flag the most important from among these that should have contributed to this budget being more efficient, let's put it that way? And the third question is, speaking of our Mr. Pamgukchan left, it's obvious that the education system is an actual factor in state security. And this is exactly the question pertaining to what my colleague asked. How do you see the expansion of the budget? First and foremost, I'm referring to education. Thank you for the question, Mr. Gevorkyan. I will try to, when I say stillborn and detached from life, yes, we enact laws that are not delivering. So we have to see what's their efficiency. In the programmatic budget, we oversee the results and see whether the idea underlying the budget delivered on what it was meant to. This is what we say when we mean oversight. We're talking about many complaints that we hear about the high interest rates on the loans. The citizens think that they pay multiple times and the interest is too high. We understand that there is a risk factor underlying the high interest rates. There are certain risks that should be reduced, which will lead in lower interest. The legal risks are at least belong to our turf, and therefore in our discussions we can identify these risks, reduce them, and as a result get lower interest rates. Another question about education. Yes, in reality, how is the budget built? It has revenue, it has expenditures. The revenue should expand in order for us to be able to spend more on, for example, education. There are various channels to do it. Increasing tax revenue, proper administration, proper tax policy. You don't need to increase the rate. You just have to have a proper rate so that the economic agents don't evade. And then the environment should result in investment, in increased tax base. Part of the deficit is financed from various sources, including external debt. Essentially, that's how the budget is formed. Usually we see how much we have and distribute based on that, but that's not the desirable way. We have to look at what we need and then look at the sources in such a way as to take care of the expenses. Thank you. I would also like to reflect briefly on the following. Usually the issues that exist in the financial system, they ask for comprehensive solutions without overestimating the role of the Ministry of Finance, which is what the public governance system already evaluates. They do it through maximally efficiently using the existing resources. And I believe the issue is asking for a comprehensive solution. It's not only the taxes, it's also expanding the market, expanding the labor market, the finance market, which will make it possible to provide a comprehensive solution for the issues you referred to. Thank you. Of course, I simply emphasize one area of discussion which belongs to our domain, and we could, through discussing it with experts, find some solutions, as a result reducing certain risks. increasing the quality of life of our citizens is what I have had in mind, and I spoke exactly in that vein. But you're quite right, there's a whole diversity of issues to be discussed. Thank you. Sergei Bagration will ask the next question. Madam Tandilan, I have two questions. The first is, in fact, our economic relations is where the government has almost no regulatory role in regulating the economy. Now we work under program budgeting, and you mentioned it's very important to estimate the efficiency thereof. Will this not result in the methodology of budgeting based on the results? And in the current conditions, what bracket of taxes in GDP do you think would be optimal? The purpose of program budgeting is to see what do we get as a result of each dram spent. If we move on to program budgeting and say what is it that we want to get by spending this much this year, the results would be controllable exactly through program budgeting. If we take this path, we will be able to see the efficiency of every penny spent. As for the next question, although this is in the turf of the Standing Committee on Economy, we still think tax collection in the GDP is not sufficient. We will try to understand what would be sufficient, but that's up to a professional discussion. I have to say that I've been following this matter and can say that this ratio is insufficient. If we could find a solution through our discussions, I think various experts may have their own differing opinions on that. The best in this case ratio we still have not determined yet. You want to respond, Mr. Bagration? Madam Tandilian, you referred to the issue that this may be up for the discussions of the Economy Committee, but it should be based on the analysis of your committee. You have to arrive at your budgeting by having a clear opinion of the Economy Commission, which should clearly state which interval of taxes in GDP they want for this year or next year. Unless you have that, unless you know what are the taxes to expect, there's no way to think about how to distribute them, this revenue. So I would like to get your approach as a future chairperson of this committee. Are you ready to discuss with the Standing Committee on Economy the ratio of taxes in the GDP and how to regulate this? Thank you, Mr. Bagration. Quite naturally, the cooperation between the committees has to be raised to a new level, especially these two committees. I believe through joint sessions we could also be able to raise certain issues that pertain to our areas. This would be the best format when every specialist speaks up. The economists and finance people sometimes have divergent opinions. This may lead to increased quality of our discussions. I think it would be appropriate and is necessary. Babken Tunyan. Tisa Gaprelen, sorry. Namtandilian, the axis of your intervention was oversight. Days ago, you failed to be elected to the Deputy Speaker of the Parliament office. Essentially, my step was criticized harshly by your faction. I have no doubt you will be elected to this office. And I expect from you a frank answer so that our compatriots can hear it. Will we not have, in this case, a chairperson in office who will be overseeing the budget? Will we not? I just didn't get the question. What was the question? I'll still attempt at an answer. In reality, professionalism and impartiality are features that should belong to people who work in this area, whether it's audit, whether it's accounting, whether it's finances. and my membership in reputable international organizations and associations allow me to claim without redundant modesty that my impartiality can hardly be doubted. You know that the head chairperson of a committee is more of professional work, whereas the deputy chair of the parliament is more of a political occupation. Both matter for me, of course, but you should not doubt in the high quality of the performance of the committee, irrespective of the results of this vote. Do you want to respond? Thank you for the question. I'm satisfied, and I got reassured once again that I did not take a wrong decision to vote against you for the office of the deputy speaker. I'm glad that you're happy with your choice. And now it's Tunyan in our midst. Madam Tandilyan, let me tell you that I'm very glad that it's you who will be in charge of the Finance and Budget Committee. This is the first time when this important committee goes to the opposition. In your intervention, you listed your factions and described importance to the oversight over the central bank activities. Your colleague Georg Gorgisyan from your faction in the election campaign said that the central bank is absolutely out of any oversight and we need to devise mechanisms for the National Assembly to be able to oversee the central bank. Do you share that opinion? And if yes, what are those mechanisms at this point that you could propose to make that kind of oversight more efficient? Thank you, Mr. Tunyan. In reality, the central bank has the certain constitutional powers to restrain inflation and a number of others. In this respect, the central bank is a structure that enjoys independence, which is good. At the same time, we have to understand that its fiscal policy results in serious consequences. Therefore, the National Assembly should have the power to work with the central bank using oversight mechanisms, which I emphasized in my intervention, to organize discussions, to invite the relevant bodies to take part in these discussions, and at least discussing solutions. In this respect, it's quite appropriate for the central bank to enjoy its independence, but it should also be accountable to the National Assembly, that is to the public at large. So the broad powers that the central bank has, it needs to be used to the benefit of our economic and financial systems. You want to respond, Mr. Tunyan? Thank you. So essentially, you believe that the central bank is not out of any oversight and there is no need for additional mechanism of oversight? Did I get it right? I believe that the accountability of the central bank vis-a-vis the National Assembly should be enhanced through various mechanisms, including, among others, through more frequent discussions and raising issues in the committee. And in this respect, the National Assembly does have those powers. So, Vinar Vartanyan. Madam Tandilyan, I would like to mention that I'm glad that it would be you assuming this high office. Here I am. I'm glad that it will be you assuming the chair of this committee, and the question pertains to insurance, agricultural insurance. How do you see investments in this and what issues do you see that may arise? Thank you for the question. You know, the presence of the insurance companies and their competition in Armenia is something that I still deem to be insufficient. We understand that most of the finance system comprises banks. 80%. There are less credit, finance, or insurance organizations in that makeup. In this respect, the increased number and more competition between insurance companies would contribute to their functions, including agricultural insurance. In this respect, we will have an opportunity to also think about reducing agricultural loans interest once the insurance is there. In this respect, we simply need to, you know that it's after all a market, and the insurance companies' interest to expand their scope of operation is what we have to first ensure a competitive framework for. No response, and we now move on to the next question. Thank you, Mme. Tandelian. In your response to the question of our colleague Georgian, you also partially covered my question. I was talking about the high interest rates on loans and the risk of bad faith borrowers. Figuratively, there are losses that have to be then ascribed to the interest rate. There have been many publications about former high-ranking officials who did not deliver on their loan commitments, which reflected on common citizens having to pay higher interest rate on their loans. I would like to get your opinion. Would it be possible to publish alongside high-ranking officials' income statements also their credit history, which will allow for the citizens to see how those officials are delivering on their loan obligations? Thank you for the question. I have to say that yes, unpaid loans contribute to the risk that in turn affects the discovery of the interest rate. You're quite right. As a result, all of the citizens have to cover those liabilities. During the YELC, we were discussing a anti-corruption toolkit. Yes, I think it would be important to not only see their credit history as well as the balance they owe. To what extent is it in tune with their incomes? I think that public figures, and in particular high-ranking officials, have to declare also this in their statements. This will allow us to control their behavior and the extent to which their income is in tune with their expenses. No response. The next will be Garine Bosan from Prosperous Armenia. Thank you, Madam Tandilian. Once you take charge of this committee, there will be very serious functions. There will be mechanisms of oversight. My question also pertains to program budgeting introduction. It's an important process which has launched here for 10 years already. We know that this investment project should be over in 2019. So by 2019 we should have switched 100% to program budgeting. What's your take on this? How important do you think it is? And if you do, are you ready to really complete this transition this year? We all understand that the purpose of it is to increase efficiency of financial management and to control, especially control in the parliament of this process. Thank you, Madam Pawasyan. You may be aware that the budget of 2019 is already drawn through program budgeting approach. I joined this work at the last stage when it was essentially mostly completed. You're quite right, this is a result of years of work and I have a very high opinion of the outcome. This will exactly be that which will allow the MPs and the National Assembly to implement their oversight function. So I'm positive about it. And since will be the first year when we do 100% program budgeting, we have to go through some work to hone this further and improve the basic indicators in such a way so that they reflect the purpose, the importance of the spending of those means. No response. Hamazat Danelian. Madam Tandilian, I have many questions, but I will only ask one. You reflected at great length, quite appropriately in your intervention, about the importance of the oversight function of the committee. Let me add an overtone. It's exceptional compared to any other standing committee. Your political team for weeks on end was proposing a premise. Considering the current structure of the government, the police, the national security, and SRC being outside of parliamentary control, the situation is remarkable. So, calling upon your professional impartiality, I would like you to tell us, the committee that you're about to head, what's the toolkit of your oversight over those three bodies, if at all? You could list one or two, maybe looking at that part of the whole for the people to learn. Since in that part of the whole we have many experienced MPs, they are aware that for many years on end in this whole and in the parliamentary committees, various officials have been summoned who essentially may have refused to turn up. This is the problem. An official who is not a member of the cabinet has the right not to report, not to come once summoned, which is why we want to emphasize the importance of this official's work to be open to public, whether expenditures or functions thereof is what we need to be able to ask questions about, which is why we think that no one should be left out of parliamentary oversight. It shouldn't be their goodwill or discretion. There have been officials who did come, but that was just the expression of their goodwill. So the leverage that the parliament has over the cabinet should extend over all kinds of public agencies, committees, institutions, and attached bodies. That's what I'm referring to, Mr. Danelian, and I believe that irrespective, of course, this oversight function is relatively new in this scope attached to the committee, but we need to be able to address questions to all of these officials. Thank you.
Mrs. Tandilan, you didn't answer my question, I think. You quite skillfully disavowed. The question is the following: whether the committee you'll be heading has the toolkit of oversight and has some tools in that toolkit to implement control over the State Revenue Committee and a number of other bodies that you mentioned. Well, Mr. Danilan, I mentioned that in my answer. Not only that committee, but other committees as well have that tools. But at the same time, the member of the government may come to this parliament and be asked certain questions. There's been many times when the representatives of these governmental bodies came to the parliament and avoided answering those questions, because when you come to the parliament, the responsibility level is much higher rather than when you don't. I can tell you that as a member of the government. Hi, Gevorkyan, next question. Mrs. Tandilyan, my question might seem a little strange to you, but if we put the position of the deputy chairman of the National Assembly on the scales and the chairman of the Committee on Financial and Monetary Issues, then just in considering it in the financial sector, which is more influential for the opposition, do you think? The financial, budgetary, the fiscal committee, that essentially never belonged to the opposition, or the deputy chairman of the National Assembly? Thank you for the question. Mr. Gevorkyan, in fact, level of influence is the same, but they are different. One is political and the other is professionally technical. Independently from which one I occupy, the implementation of the functions shall be done fully. So all those functions ex officio given will be fully implemented. I understand the context in your question, but we have to remember that indeed that committee was never under the chairmanship of the opposition, but this time it may be and it will also be represented by the ruling party. So the function of the head of that committee is not the most influential. As maybe there are certain discretionary functions, but in that respect, the influence of the MP has to do with the devotion, diligence, and selfless commitment. That's what an MP has to do independently from the position he or she occupies. Thank you. Anything to add to that? No. And now Herikas Tigranyan. Mrs. Tandilian, I don't doubt that you will be chairing in that commission. My questions related to effective management of public finance. Naturally, there are problems here related to accountability and transparency. We have the commitment to raise the efficiency of our expenditures and raise the efficiency of public finance in general. Previously, the settlement committees, the tallying commissions submitted reports saying that there were some inefficient costs made, expenditures made in the public spending. However, there is no responsibility for spending the public funds ineffectively, which means it may continue. There are not very expedient expenditures made, and there are no consequences. So I'd like to hear your opinion about the new standards of accountability. How do you see the possibility to increase efficiency? Thank you for the question. Indeed, the program budgeting as such was aimed at improving that efficiency. That's the main tool that helps us improve the efficiency. You're right, there were no consequences unless there are any abuses or violations of the law. So the role of the tallying commission here is quite high. That's why I mentioned that we must expect professionalism, impartiality, and independence, because only in that case we will be able to elaborate a system that will contribute to a picture that reflects fairness. And this is the political will, this is the publicization of all those reports, the provision of that information to the general public so that the people know what the policy of the government is and what the level of efficiency is, and what the level of the minister or the parliamentarian is. So I'm hoping that through my work I will improve that environment. Thank you. Anything to add, please? Thank you for your answer. Well, I can also see the solution in improving the functions or the leverage of the tallying commission. I'm sure that your professionalism will help to establish a better work or coordination of this committee, because while you were the Minister of Labor and Social Affairs, you always had the opportunity to do that job, and we had the opportunity to cooperate. I'm sure it will work here. Thank you, Mrs. Tigranyan. In fact, I'm quite scrupulous with the issue of professionalism of this chamber, of this committee. I'm sure through our work we will definitely elaborate the necessary situation. Thanks a lot. Hovannes Hovannisyan. Thank you. Congratulations, Mrs. Tandilian, with being nominated in this very important position. My questions related to increase in the funding for education and science. You answered that question partially, education-wise. However, the impression was that Mr. Can Cugazyan was speaking and not you, saying that if there is money, there will be more revenue and a bigger budget. So, being very well aware of the protective stance of the Ministry of Finance in increasing the fundings, I have to ask you, how do you see the possibility to add the funding? I'm so glad that you are the one speaking of that, because I do not share that opinion at all. I just spoke of how it has to be done, whereas how I'm going to be doing it is, first of all, based on needs assessment. We have to understand to what extent to what share of the GDP we see the increase with the respective funding for the sector. As regards the education and the infrastructure thereof, these are priorities, strategic priorities, but we have to understand that investments, especially in education, are capital investments. These are not expenditures and costs, respectively. They will be reflecting upon the development of our economy and progress thereof. In this respect, I should say that I do not share that point of view. We simply need to see the main priorities we have, get the overall picture, and instruct the Ministry of Finance to guarantee that amount of money in the budget. I agree with you that the funding of the educational sector is not in the best condition, and of course we have to speak of efficiency here. It's not just paying money and increasing efficiency here. It's clear that we have underfunded education and science. Thank you. Anything to add? Yes. I just raised the question, also related to education, in order to have you speak, or to have you promise, to have you yourself committed from that high platform you're standing at. I just wanted you to say that. Thank you. Mr. Hovhannisyan, I'm so glad that you are asking that question. I'm glad, on the contrary, because you are the majority. Thank you. Thank you. Let me assure you that Mr. Janjogazan will earmark the public funds for the educational sector with pleasure from the moment you show where the public funds are. Arman Abovian for the next question. Prosperous Armenia. Good afternoon. Good morning, Mrs. Tandilan. I welcome you, and I'm now trying to voice the question raised by the general public. We have about 7 billion of a foreign debt, and only for servicing it for 2019-2020 there have been serious funds invested in our budget. Now, at the same time, the GDP is about 10 billion US dollars. And once again, I'm just voicing the question of our citizens. Now, what's the level of risk? Because 7 billion is a very big amount. And the second, is there any vision of our fiscal policy in order to somehow slow down the growth of that debt? Thank you for the question, Mr. Abovian. In fact, you know that the law on budget has changed. And from the moment it exceeds a certain threshold, the government has to come up with a program of restoration, of rehabilitation, very often reinvesting in the capital costs and less costly infrastructure, and gradually bring up a program of how they see the servicing of large debt. Naturally, the higher is that threshold, the more dangerous and risky it is. However, we know that the law enshrines such a regulatory framework, in the application of which, based upon the thresholds, the government is obliged to come to the parliament and report to the MPs of the mechanisms it has for mitigating the situation. Specifically, the requirement to make more capital investments, in the result of which, and through the development of the economy, will be able to service those debts. That's the real toolkit the parliament may apply to oversee the performance of the government in this respect. We understand there are a lot of costs inevitable, and indeed we have to borrow in order to take care of those. But we have toolkit in order to oversee such costs. Fiscal, monetary tools that the parliament masters to see how efficient a certain loan program is. So we together have to somehow oversee that process and provide for the efficiency. Very well. Tigran Ulikhanyan, Prosperous Armenia. Thank you. About a month and a half, 2 months ago, through a Q&A with the Prime Minister, I spoke of the trend of reduction of the prices for minerals in the world, and that the influence of it on Armenian currency. We both inferred that that was a real possibility. So essentially we have to somehow resist such multiplication effects. That's mostly related to oil industry, and according to some forecasts raised on that day, we have already the situation with $60 of the lowest threshold for the crude oil, with some forecasts of the reduction. Now, in regard to the Russian currency, Russian Federation has made very serious interventions. What's the size of interventions from the Armenian Central Bank? Do you know that? To what extent or how was the negative reflection of dollars, Armenian drams, currency ratio restrained? And right before the new year, the oil producing and purchasing countries reduced the overall volume of export with up to 50,000 barrels per day, and if I'm not mistaken, about 60,000 reduced from Saudi Arabia. So it's more of a restraint, I may say, or something that comes to stabilize the situation. So in a nutshell, if this situation continues, Armenian dram as currency depending upon such resources will be threatened. What do you see as your work in this context and with the tools of your committee? Thank you, Mr. Ulikhanyan. Let me assure you that, first of all, we are going to meet the responsibles at the central bank to clarify the tools that may be used regarding the process of tackling such problems, and we will have the opportunity together to assess the level of efficiency of performing, provided there were no changes in the situation that might already be considered positive. But I'm sure you will have the opportunity to ask your questions to the responsible persons directly. We understand that there are different economic factors impacting the currency rates, including the remittances, and due to the increase or reduction in these remittances, the currency fluctuates. Yes, the central bank has mechanisms of restraint, but we have to understand that currency is also good, and the ratio between Armenian drams and US dollars depends on demand supply. And of course, the central bank has the machinery to use here, but we have to understand that in market relations and by leaving the real rate of our currency, then that's the price for money, essentially, we have to understand. I can assure you that you will have the opportunity, especially by using the toolkit, to ask such questions to the responsible persons. Thank you. Anything to add, Mr. Ulikhanyan? A response? Well, let me then clarify my concerns further. Do we have enough money in Armenia so that in crisis, pay attention to the price for petrol, and you may understand what happens with oil, at least at a level visible for the consumers. So is there the possibility, do we have enough money in the country to apply proportionally capable interventions and survive in crisis? Like if there is a price crisis or a currency crisis with rubles, for example, because we depend naturally on some natural resources coming. So will we be able to survive? And my next question, through the discussion of the budget for the next year, will you be offering increase in pensions and salaries if the government doesn't do that? Thank you, Mr. Ulikhanyan. The central bank has reserves, and you are well aware of how much reserves there are. You can clearly calculate yourself. But I agree with you that the information must be easily accessible and discussed. Now, as regards my suggestion related to increase of pensions and salaries, you know that the senility pension is now 85,000. The loss of breadwinner pension has also increased. The welfare payments have increased, and you know that it is through revenues that the average salaries may increase. Indeed, the salaries are low, and I'm sure you'll speak of that in your speech. We have to consider the possibilities of increase thereof, and we have to have permanent decisions, permanent commitment to increasing salaries every year, regularly. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Tandelian. Oh, no. Oh, yes, Avika Azarian for the next question. Thank you. Mrs. Tandelian, there are two questions related to the banking sector. First, when citizens get loans, apart from the main interest rate, which is clear, like 12%, 15%, it's very high, there are various notorious payments, especially service fee, granting fee, I don't know. What do you think? Will the committee be able to intervene here and eliminate such redundancies, such negative phenomena? Because ultimately the interest rate becomes very high. And the second question related to banking piracy, so-called. Say a citizen arrives at a bank to take a loan. That has happened to me. I'm at the bank signing for a loan, and the bank refuses after I present all the data. Now the citizen leaves that bank and goes to a loan organization, to credit organization, and fills the application there at the credit organization. The credit organization approves a loan of 500,000 Armenian drams, for example, and provides that loan from the bank where the citizen was refused to get one, in the name of the same citizen, respectively. So, apart from interest rates and some service fees and granting fees, they get 30%. 30% have a advance payment. Are you aware of this vicious phenomena, and can we anyhow eliminate this? Thank you, Mr. Aghazarian. Yes, there is a nominal interest rate that is published, and we know how much it is, but there is also an effective interest rate. That includes all different service fees and other fees. So, in the result of which, naturally, the interest rate grows, but the bank has a very clear obligation to inform the citizen of these. And sometimes even make certain markings in the contracts, to make them in bold or mark them somehow in the contract, underline, so that the citizens learn of the real interest rate to be paid. In this respect, I have to say that the banking sector is the least competitive sector in the Republic of Armenia, with apparently a very large number of banks operating, so competition matters here. I agree that the interest rate is high, but at the same time they are obliged to inform the citizens, to notify, to warn, and there's also a system of financial ombudsmen where you can go if something's obscure and something's unclear. Yes, I may agree that the situation is really arduous and dismal, and many people are now under the burden of these loans and interest rate payments. We may improve the situation. We can discuss whether there is an opportunity to reduce the interest rate somehow. Now, as regards your question, I may say that the same credit organization has its own risks. Naturally, the bank may refrain from providing the loan because it's not ready to take the risk. And maybe it can serve some other citizens that are less risky and would not provide the loan to more risky ones. So provided that credit organization is at a higher risk, it may take a higher interest rate. At the same time, this is not the most problematic part of it. There are organizations that register corporate statuses to get the loans instead of citizens, or for the citizens. This is a really vicious phenomenon, and we have to eliminate it, because In that case, the citizens really appear in a trap because that organization has taken the loan for that citizen instead of it, independently from the fact whether they were worth it or not. So this is the situation. We may find different mechanisms and studied experience to protect our citizens better. Thank you. Anything to add? You know, Mrs. Tandilian, where the problem is. Most of our citizens, the government is not able to provide for, for health service. And sometimes the kings are the ones to take care of their family members. They need like 400,000 Armenian drams to pay for the medical service. You're thinking they are reading those small letters in the contract. They would immediately go and take that 400,000 not knowing that they will be paying 1 million drams afterwards. Respectively, we have to protect our citizens. I understand that the banks are obliged to perform in accordance with the law, etc., but we have to protect our citizens as well. Yes, because we're not able to provide for the medical service, and on the other side, we don't take care of our citizens. It would be great if that bank or the banker went to a grocery store and get a permit to buy a sausage. Well, the solution to that is medical insurance, Mr. Agazarian, rather than credit organizations, because providing loans, well, they don't care what they provide the loan for. They don't know and they don't want to know what you're going to be using that money for. So medical insurance will solve the problem. I may also ask a rhetorical question. Provided they didn't have the opportunity to get the credit, wouldn't that be even worse for the family or the citizen? In this respect, yes, we have problems unsolved in this country, as a result of which some citizens appear in worse conditions. It will be the function of the government, of the state, to think of that and suggest or offer some protection mechanisms to our citizens. Thank you. Thank you, Mrs. Tandilian. You may now take your seat, and now we register for exchange of opinions on the topic, please. Two MPs in line. First is Mrs. Naira Zorabian, Prosperous Armenia. Thank you, distinguished chair, dear colleagues. This is one of the most pivotal committees, and Mrs. Tandilian nominated for chairmanship. Indeed, this is going to be the most overburdened committee. Oversight, the budget performance. Your professionalism will definitely be enough to take that burden. I may simply say that you're getting the unreserved assistance of the Prosperous Armenia political party in continuation of what Mr. Melkomian and Mr. Tunyan mentioned. Indeed, it is an unprecedented situation of the parliament discussing the candidacies of the chairman of the standing committees for 5 days in a row. We really see very conceptual, very professional discussions, and this is a very positive message, a clear signal that we will have a professional parliament where people have arrived to do real professional work. Let me say that Prosperous Armenia will be supporting the candidates nominated from My Step political party, because we see through discussions that people are nominated from this party that are really able to invest everything they can in order to organize our parliamentary work in a professional and a literate manner. I'm sure that this professional start will be continued in the same spirit. Thank you. Sofia Hovsepian, please. Thank you. Distinguished Chair, dear colleagues, I would like to speak about Mane Tandilian and say why it is important to have her as the main responsible person for this sector. I've known her since 2013-2014 through the movement DEMEM, or I'm Against, when it was her very high professionalism expressed, the ability to stand by all the members of that movement, fighting against the compulsory component of the cumulative pension, the funded component. And the most important thing I wanted to mention is that through the 6 months of her office as the Minister of Labor and Social Affairs, I've known her as the Deputy Governor of the region of Shirak. I've been responsible for the regulation of the sector, and I regularly had problems and I regularly had questions, and I asked those questions, and never she's left a single question unanswered. Very quickly she answered and she found solutions. Respectively, this is just another fact in the sense that being a very responsible person, she's going to head a very responsible committee, and I'm thinking that she's one of the very few irreplaceable also persons in this sector, so I would be grateful. I'm urging everyone to vote for her without reservations. And very shortly, I will refer to the allusion by Mrs. Samsonyan related to Mr. Karapetyan. I'd like to mention the following. Dear Mrs. Samsonyan, Mr. Karapetyan, also in the territorial administration sector, was one of the very unique, few, and maybe irreplaceable persons in our country. So, if we are anyhow casting doubts upon the election or non-election of this person, then we must not be following our own ambitions, but the ambitions of the state herein. Because if not elected, if Mr. Karapetyan is not elected, then the whole country will suffer. Thank you. Thank you for the final speech. You may take the floor. You may. If you don't wish to, then we may turn to the next phase. And now we give the floor to the chairman of the Italian Commission, Hovakimyan, to tell you about the place and the format of the election. Before Mr. Hovakimyan approaches, I'd like to continue what Mrs. Zorabian was saying and even expand further to express the hope that all the factions, after such saturated, eloquent, and effective discussion, will vote for all the presented candidates, I hope. Mr. Hovakimyan, please. Good afternoon, distinguished colleagues. Finally, we're here. Long expected. And I will now present the number 8 protocol related to the voting procedure for the election of the chairman of the standing committees. The voting will take place in the lobby next to the main hall from 11:30 to 1:30 p.m. Please participate in an organized manner so that the elections go well. You will have 11 ballots. Pay attention, please. 11 ballots you will get with respective names of every committee and the candidates nominated. A separate one for each committee, respectively. And entering the voting area. Please pay attention, because there may be there may be a lot of confusion because of the number of the ballots. Pay attention so that we don't have invalid ones. I'm sorry, Mr. Hovakimyan. I didn't hear that well. There's 1 hour. There are 2 hours, 11:30 to 1:30 for the voting. Yes, because there are 11 ballots, and I may suppose that each of our colleagues may need 2 to 3 minutes to cast the vote. Respectively, we have provided 2 hours for the voting process. Distinguished colleagues, we will be back in the main hall after we hear the call. Yes, there will be an announcement, and you will come back. That's it? Yes, that's it, Mr. Wagner. Thank you. We'll restart after we sum up the results